right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started real quick, everybody. So, good morning, everybody. I first want to thank Lori and Mallory for having us out today to teach on the commercial contract and letter of intent. We absolutely love coming over to Eagles World and teaching for you guys. So feel free to ask any questions during this class today. A little bit about myself. I've been in the real estate industry since I was 14. So March will mark the 24th year I've been in this industry. I have a real estate degree from Florida State. I absolutely love working for you guys. So once you're in this industry, it's hard to get out of it, right? A little bit about Mr. Riley Williams himself. He started his practice here in Jacksonville in January of 2004. So now 20 years later, over 20 years later, now he has 4 locations in town, including 5 real estate attorneys to help you with any of your commercial or your residential real estate closing. So don't forget we do residential. We will be doing a party for the 20th year of us being open, so be on the lookout for that. I got all their information. Thank you for sending that. Love y'all. So where are we located? We're located in Riverside, right next to 5 Points in a 3-story historic home. We're located at the Town Center, right off St. John's Bluff and Town Center Parkway, and our own building there. We're located in Jacks Beach, right underneath the Jacks Beach Water Tower, and then our 4th location is in St. Johns County, right off Longleaf Pine and 9B, so right across the street from Patriot Oaks Academy. So those are our 4 locations to help you guys and your clients with your closing needs. So like I stated, we do have 5 real estate attorneys on the team, so whether you're dealing with residential or commercial, please reach out to us if you want us to review a contract, if you want us to review the verbiage that's going to protect your client and just make sure you're wording something properly. If you get a weird email from a title company and you're like, what does this mean? How do I respond to if you get a weird email from a title company or anything, you're like, hey, what does this mean? How do I respond? Please reach out to us. Even if we're not closing the transaction, feel free to reach out to us. I work when you guys work, so that's 7 days a week. That's nice. You have my cell phone numbers at the bottom of that smaller square piece of paper. Please save it into your phone. And then we do order title on list. I'll repeat that again, right? So we order title on the executed listing agreement, not on the executed contract. This way we can go ahead and get ahead of the game. We can go ahead and run the title search early, see if like maybe another owner pops up that they say like there's only 2 people in ownership. It turns out there's 3, so we need to get somebody else to sign documents. Maybe they say they only owe for 1 mortgage, but they have 3 mortgages outstanding. So, it's nice to be ahead of the game and know what we're looking at, and it doesn't cost you or your seller anything extra. You pay for that at the closing table. So if for some reason the listing falls through or the contract falls through, we're not charging anybody for that title search. We're charging it at the table. So if you get a new listing, go ahead and send us the agreement right when you get it instead of when you actually have a buyer on it. We do a calculator on our website. That's one of the QR codes that you have on that flyer. You can do seller net sheets, buyer cost sheets, or multiple offer situations, or you can call me, email me, or text me, and I'll do it for you. But it's pretty cool. You can do it from your cell phone or your laptop, and you can convert it into PDF and text it straight to your client or email it straight to your client. And then you're able to save them all. So then, like if you get an offer in, you can edit it and just edit whatever the offer comes in at instead of redoing the entire thing. Or you can just call me and I'll re-edit it and I'll do the entire thing. It's totally fine. So please reach out to me. I think I did one for you last week. Yeah, so I do them all the time. So please don't.
And he was happy, okay?
Okay, good.
Now I see something else here. He's a veteran.
Yes. So if you have a military or veteran seller, all you have to do is when you send over the contract, let us know and we will deduct $200 off our settlement fee. So we go off the honor system.
Even the
not
mortgage
the
is a VA mortgage.
Perfect. So just when you shoot it in, just tell us that and then we'll deduct the $200 off. So please remember that. And then we do promote and sponsor open houses and broker opens. Susan can attest to that. So we will promote it on our social media. We'll provide gift cards. We're actually sponsoring one as we speak. I just left St. Augustine to drop it off because I can't be there, but I still promoted it and dropped it off. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us for that. We do promote it on our social media sites, on my social media sites. We do the gift card. If it's a weekday, we can provide lunch. We try to get other agents there. And then we even have like open house feedback forms. So if you don't have any of those, we can do that with your logo and our logo on it, and you can even edit it. So if there's something specific you want them to answer, because your homeowner won't like fix the paint, you can specifically say, hey, what do you think of the paint color? Whatever. And we can edit it. If you want to learn more about working with our company with J. Riley Williams and how we can help you grow your business, because we do have like a farming tool and things of that nature and marketing tools, please reach out to me on my cell and I'll take you to coffee or breakfast on us so you can get to learn more about us and if we'd be a good fit to work together. And again, my name is Taylor Stafford and all J. Riley Williams closings are tailor-made to fit your needs. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to him. And I'm just going to say ahead of time, ask all the questions. And at the end, if you have any residential questions too, feel free to ask them because you have his presence for a while.
Can I hold you up for just a second? So Taylor had mentioned, and we like to like reinforce, like go ahead and order the title. You know, we're happy to do that. It's not going to be any expense. It's going to be passed on to you or your seller or anybody if it doesn't end up closing. If it doesn't end up closing, it's just not going to be charged and collected at the closing if it gets there. And since we're talking about the commercial stuff, I want to bring up that.
We do it with that too.
We do it with that too, but I want to bring up the example of like the Zoom call with the seller. So
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but like the fraud is very pervasive these days. And so if you
Especially on land.
yeah, so if you have vacant land, it's I think doubly important to like let's go ahead and order the title and that you feel comfortable with like who the seller is. Because with the vacant land, maybe the real owner of the property is not going by and looking at the property all that much, or if it's like some kind of property that's not permanently occupied, you could, if there's a for sale by owner sign in front of these properties, a lot, you know, and it's happening enough that like, is this really the true owner that's got it listed for sale? And so you have an example of like somebody approached somebody to list the property for them and it seemed a little sketchy. They weren't in the country.
They're from Australia, but the property was here. And I had just told him over lunch what basically we're telling you guys right now. And he kind of was probably doing what you guys are doing. Like, yeah, I never hear of this. It's fine. And then like literally 2 weeks later, he gets a call from somebody in Australia wanting to list their land in Jacksonville. And he's like, hold up, red flag. And he even said like, if I wouldn't have said anything, he wouldn't have even thought twice and he would just catch the ball rolling. And so he ended up doing a Zoom call with the guy just to like, hey, let's just talk on Zoom so we get to know each other. And it was total fake. He sent me a video of it because he like couldn't help himself. He recorded it a little bit and it was glitching the whole time. You could tell it wasn't him. And it was like, this was going to waste his time, the other guy's time, and who knows what else it could have transpired.
Yes.
So
it's real. And so, you know, if you're going to get into the commercial part of it, I think it's great, but you might want to be a little bit extra careful if it's vacant land or it's just a property that's not currently occupied by a tenant or the owner or anything like that.
Or if the price seems too good to be true, like that other piece of land that was $200,000 under market value.
So what they do is they say, okay, you know, they get it under contract and, oh, I'm not going to be there for the closing. I need to like have everything mailed away for the closing. And then they basically pay a notary that's willing to like take thousands of dollars to like basically commit fraud and notarize the signature when they know that it's not really the owner. So we have had that happen, unfortunately, and it does happen and it continues to happen. So,
and if you ever think there's something like sketch is happening, just call us and give us the address and we can try to look into it ourselves too and look on Sunbiz and try to do some digging for you guys. We love to dig.
thank you. Thanks,
I'll be
Taylor.
right here. I'm just gonna
Okay.
go here.
All right, so I wanted to talk about 2 of the forms that you guys should have in front of you. The first one is the commercial letter of intent, and then this is the FAR commercial contract that you have. So this, like my other classes, I think you guys, pretty much all of you, with one exception, have been to my classes. So encourage questions. Please ask questions. It helps it to go a little bit better other than me just kind of droning on about these forms. So the first thing I want to talk about, this is the commercial letter of intent. So we have a Word version of this. If you want it, Taylor's got it. And she can email it to you if you'd like to have it. And so this is just a pretty generic a form or generic template for an LOI for the purchase. There can be separate template for a lease if it's going to be a commercial lease. So the first question is like, why? What's the reason for doing a letter of intent? as opposed to not doing one and just going straight into contract, right? So typically in the residential, you fill out the NEPAR form or the FAR form, and then you present it to the listing agent with no letter of intent, but maybe sometimes you guys do email, hey, this is what we're thinking about, purchase prices, are we like in the same ballpark, that type of thing. And that's what this is for, in the commercial context, when there's gonna be a fairly detailed purchase and sale agreement. So this commercial form is great. I highly recommend that you use it when you can. If you're gonna use this form, you probably don't need a commercial letter of intent. But I did want to talk about the commercial letter of intent, just because if you are gonna do more of this, you may have a need to do it where you might have like a 20-page heavily negotiated purchase and sale agreement. And before you kind of get into that and pay like other professionals, like lawyers and engineers and other types of professionals that would be involved in negotiating, like say, a huge, apartment complex where we have like 100+ units and we want to look at rent rolls and those types of things, and there's different representations and warranties. Or, for example, you've got this huge piece of property out west and a residential developer wants to buy that property, but they want to basically do all their due diligence and see if they can get like the plat that they want before they actually close on the property. You might have like a 2-year closing date and a 180-day due diligence period. You probably want to like just hammer out those material terms in the commercial letter of intent, as opposed to the buyer and seller paying their attorneys to negotiate a long contract like that. Because if you can't even get close on what's the purchase price, how long is my due diligence period, when's the closing date, there's no sense in spending all that time and effort into the contract. So that's where these things typically come in. What's going to be a little more complicated deal is that's when you would have these. And so the buyer representative, if you're working with the buyer, you would fill this out, present this to the folks that have the listing, and then just come up with these major terms here, and then you would go to contract. That's typically how it would work. So real quick, the letters of intent, they're not binding, but if somebody's willing to go to the effort to do this, you're probably gonna have a good chance of like actually getting the contract put into place. Meaning if like everybody signed and put these figures in and the deal falls through, it's not gonna be a basis to say we had a deal because this letter of intent was put together. It covers most but not all of the material terms. So they're typically non-binding. Okay, so this is just a generic, I'm gonna purchase a building on Main Street here in Jacksonville. But again, I think the main difference with the commercial versus the residential transactions is like the business stuff, it's all a numbers game. And it all comes down to, is it worth like the investment that the buyer's gonna put in? Like, what's the rent roll? And I have a certain cap rate or a rate of return that I need to have based on like the financing that I'm gonna get or the money that I'm gonna raise and put into this building. And so people, wonder whether I would like doing commercial deals versus residential deals. The residential stuff, like one of the best parts about that is like the first time home buyers, right? And like seeing looks on their faces at closing when they have their house. So that emotional part of it is not in the commercial stuff. It's basically, is this a good investment or is it not? And if it's not, we're just gonna walk away. So some people like dealing with numbers, non-emotional business decisions, and that's what this is. Some folks enjoy just dealing with buyers and sellers and those types of things. And so that can be like a big decision making for you. Like, do I think I would like this? I need to be probably like a little bit better with my numbers and understanding like spreadsheets and how I figure out like if the rent roll is this and the taxes are this and the insurance is this, those are the operating expenses and the income coming in. What does it look like from the standpoint of like setting the purchase price? So a little bit more numbers oriented type of practice than looking at like a single family home and would this be a good fit for the buyers that are looking for their first house, stuff like that. So here, the buyer representative and the seller. So this is a good chance too to like talk about the title issues in the sense of like who is authorized to sign on behalf of the buyer and the seller, because most of the time you're dealing with some kind of entity like an LLC or a corporation, something like that. So if you guys don't know, you can go to somebiz.org and you can punch in the name of the entity, the LLC, the corporation, the partnership, and it's going to tell you who is the authorized member of that particular entity. So those are the things that you want to use to fill in the blanks here. So you've got the buyer, and then you identify the seller here, you would identify the subject property. I think the address and real estate number would be sufficient for the letter of intent, but if you do end up going under contract, you want to make sure that you get like the legal description that you can pull off the public records to get that stuff. The seller, the buyer, and I've included like the and/or signs. So the ability to sign the contract is a little bit more important for a buyer in a commercial transaction. Um, they may have an entity that just puts the contracts or the properties under contract, and then before the closing, they will then assign it to the ultimate entity that's going to take title to the property and operate it. I've given you examples like zoning. I've got an office example, but again, like the commercial transactions can just run the gamut. You can deal with like single family homes that are rented, vacant property like we've talked about, apartment buildings, office buildings, retail strip centers. And I do find that most people that do practice in the commercial area, they end up picking like a niche where they stay because there's so much information to learn and become expert at that they typically stay. And I just do office, I just do retail, I just do land, I just do warehousing, those types of things, because it takes time to kind of get used to seeing like what the properties look like, what kind of income is coming in from those properties, and understanding like if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want to list this warehouse, and you've been doing this for 5 years, you already know like what the market is like in Jacksonville, what the rents are going to be like. So when they give you what they think it's worth, you're going to know that any buyer looking for this is going to expect like a rate of return of X, and the rents are just not going to satisfy that. And so whenever that office building or that warehouse is presented for sale, there will be like some preliminary pro formas or some spreadsheets run showing this is what we can expect for rents, this is what's comparable, this is what you think you can get, your rate of return is going to be this, and that's part of like the marketing that goes into it. Or if you're working with the buyer and you see a space and the price is that, you're going to know my folks aren't going to be interested in that. And so a lot of these commercial folks, they have a relationship with the agent. They say, let me know if something comes up that you think I might be interested in. They might not be actively themselves looking at the market, but the agent's doing that for them. And so they know these guys are in this area, they need this rate of return. And when they see something pop up, then they'll go, hey, this came up. This looks like it falls within your parameters. Do you want to take a look at it? It also kind of brings up the concept of like, if you guys if you guys are going to do commercial, they have a lot of like trade groups like the residential folks do, and I suggest that you get involved with them so that you can meet like commercial loan officers, architects, engineers, appraisers, those types of things. And they do have associations here in town. ULI, Urban Land Institute, is a big one. There are a lot of like the commercial professionals in the real commercial real estate industry. They network and they meet each other, similar to what you guys do now. And it's I advise you to do something like that if that's what you want to be involved with. And so you can meet folks that you can pick up the phone and talk to your commercial lenders and understand like what the current financing terms are, things like that. So here also like a big term, like what's the earnest money going to be, and you could potentially actually negotiate this back and forth in a commercial LOI. The buyer would submit one thing, and then the sellers would say, hey, we're going to need $25,000. Negotiate the purchase price there too. 1031 exchange. So that's something you're going to see more often in a commercial transaction. The seller may want to take the proceeds, do a 1031 exchange, and defer the tax payments to a later date. If you don't, or you're not that familiar with the 1031 exchange, and you want to do more commercial, I would recommend that you become more familiar. So IPX is in St. Augustine. Their website, I think, is ipx.com. They have a great website, has a lot of good information, some good fact, like if they are gonna do the 1031 exchange, they have to locate the property within a certain amount of time, and then they have to close on the new property within a certain amount of time. So they have all that information there. I think they even have classes that you can get CE credit for, so you may want to consider attending one of those classes and just learning a little bit more. Or your buyer may come to you and say, hey, I just sold a property, or you may have sold it for them. We're gonna do a 1031 exchange. Now I need you to go out and find a replacement property for me so that I can reinvest that money there. So it's good that you're somewhat versed in those types of transactions. The financing, you could put it, this is where you're talking about putting in a financing contingency, the closing no later there. And again, this is going to be hugely dependent on the type of commercial property that you're dealing with. So you're just buying a warehouse, basically a big square box where they're going to plant stuff and there's not a lot of finishes or anything like that inside. Maybe it doesn't take that long for them to do, like, they're still gonna wanna do like their inspections, their due diligence, maybe get an engineer out to look at the building to make sure things functioning, but it's nowhere near like, I wanna buy like a 200-unit apartment complex, and they wanna look at all the rent rolls, and they wanna do inspections of all the buildings, or like the example that I mentioned that maybe you're more familiar with is like these residential builders that wanna buy these huge tracts of land out west. They might have like a 2-year closing because they want to make sure that they can go to the county and get permission to put in so many homes, because if they can't get a certain amount of homes, they're not going to be able to get their money back, and they don't want to move forward with it, and that can take a long time to work with the county to get the approvals that they need, because you've got to talk about roads and electricity and sewage and stuff like that. So cooperation, there's a lot of information sharing, a lot of financial information. Sometimes they might even want to see tax returns. And then the inspection or the feasibility period. So this is where you're going to see a little bit longer of a period. Again, it's going to be really dependent on the type of transaction that it is. Like going back to my warehouse example, maybe you would see like 20 to 30 days for them to get their engineers to check out everything. And if it's currently being rented, they're going to want to see like what those leases look like. But again, if you're going back to my example of it's a residential builder and they're going to buy multiple acres out there, this could be like 180 days. And then even if they haven't gotten what they want in their 180 days, they may want to negotiate that I can pay a price, I can pay an additional X dollars to extend my due diligence so I can keep working with the county to figure out, hey, am I going to be able to get the number of residential units that I want? And so during this, and these are just some examples that they might want to provide, the seller's going to provide during the due diligence period, copy of the site and building plans, if it's currently rented, the leases, or rent roll, are there any environmental or engineering reports? So if you're looking at a gas station or a retail strip that has a dry cleaner there.
Underground tanks.
What's that?
Underground tanks.
Yeah, underground tanks. Has it ever been like a state site that they had to do some remediation? Is it currently there right now? And that becomes important for the lender. The lender rarely wants to get involved in a situation where the collateral is mixed up.
That can be significant cost too, because I
Yeah.
had one where it was a old gas station.
Yeah.
The price was really ridiculous, it was like 125,000 or whatever, but the mediation of all the tanks and all of that stuff was over 500,000.
And it can take years to get all that stuff cleaned up. So that's something you definitely want to find out. And that's why the due diligence period is a lot more intensive. It can take longer to try and get all that information. And so I've got like one example, copies of any correspondence with the city of Jacksonville regarding the property. So this would be more like, hey, we don't think it's being used for its highest and best use. We want to change the zoning, right? We want to move from whatever it may be to a higher density commercial office or retail or something like that. And in order to do that, we're going to need to go to the county and request a zoning change. And that can be a long and drawn out process. And even if you take the listing, you might want to talk to your sellers, like, is this really the highest and best use? You know, some of these older properties down toward like where the Shands Bridge is, and they're gonna bring in that huge bridge very soon, I think in the next couple of years. So a lot of the folks would say like, right now, it's not really zoned for its highest and best use. We like a more dense use, and so they're going to the counties and like, we want to put a Wawa here, you know, and that's not currently zoned for that. And I think that would be a great fit once that bridge is done coming over. So that can be a part of the due diligence, is trying to get that zoning changed. Okay, and so again, this language which you'd see in a contract, these contracts are gonna be like this as-is concept where they can cancel and get their binder deposit back if in their sole discretion they determine it's not suitable. And there could be some exceptions in there, like I mentioned, like with these like residential developers, sometimes they have to pay like a non-refundable fee of like X dollars to extend their, they might put, excuse me, go backwards, they might put like $100,000 binder deposit down, and then in order to extend that due diligence contingency to preserve that 100,000, they might have to pay like a fee of like $10,000, which is non-refundable, to see if they can continue to get what they want. And if they can't, they would be able to cancel and get at least their $100,000 back. Closing costs. This language here, customary between buyer and seller in Duval County, that it could still be negotiated when they go to contract, and just disclose any brokerage fee there. And so, you know, these last two paragraphs are basically, this is a non-binding agreement. You know, we're going to put the effort into hammering these major terms down, but in the end, if we can't reach a fully executed purchase and sale agreement because it devil's in the details, it's not a binding obligation for purchase and sale. And so there also is, on the second to last paragraph, you know, a time limit, which I think is good, right? It's like you would force the other side to like, let's try and negotiate this, even this letter of intent. It's only good for so long. Does anybody have any questions about the letter of intent? Sure, yeah, questions are good.
Well,
Quick question.
Sure.
You said that this is not legally binding, but this can influence the contract to be legally binding, right?
Yes, so that's a good question. It's not legally binding, and so, but once it's signed by everybody, right? Then when you're negotiating that purchase and sale agreement, when one party decides they want to change anything that's in here, yeah, then you're gonna be able to refer back to the letter of intent and say, hey, we had a purchase price of 1.5 million. Why do you have 1.75? And so, yeah, you would be able to use this to make sure like the terms here appear in the purchase and sale agreement.
Okay.
Did that?
So that's moldable. When you make the contract, it's gonna be set in stone. But if they use that, they're not, and they decide, oh, we want to change it to 1.7, and they refer to that like, well, this doesn't say that, but then they decide, well, I've decided now. There's no
Yes,
legal,
they could do that.
other than just being a jerk about it, but there's no legal ramification to.
That's right.
Okay.
You can't, hey, you said this. Usually once it's here, I find rarely do you get some, you know, you're trying to like renegotiate, so to speak, the terms here. But you're right.
Okay.
If it is possible, and one side say you're contractually bound to this purchase price. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, they're not by that contractually
Right.
bounded, but
That's right.
once it goes into here, you are contractually
Yes.
bounded. I got you. Okay, thank you.
did you have any situation when they wanna change like from commercial to industrial? Because it's a difference on zoning. Did you have
Well,
any
I know.
customer that wanna do that? Because in this case, okay, this letter is for that, but to go to the contract, they need more time to find out the zoning and things like that. I mean, we talk about changing the use of the,
Yes, I don't have like, I have had clients that needed to change the zoning, not specifically from industrial to
the
commercial.
industrial is the most difficult one to do. That's why I'm asking, because I had the customer took me to, I don't know how many places that they were for sale, but it was not for what he wants to do. Because I keep explaining to them, if you read the zoning, it's not what you need to do. Yeah, that's why.
So I have had like, the changing of the zoning, just, generic thing, it's not easy, and it's a process. And so it's good, again, if you guys are gonna get involved in the commercial stuff, you should understand like what that process looks like. So you've gotta go to the county and request a change in the zoning, and that requires like a certain period where they have, and you've seen this stuff, right? Notices are posted around the property, there's gonna be a zoning hearing, within a certain amount of time. And if you wanna come up and object, I think like some of the, like if you go down, keep going down 13, and you start to getting the fruit code, you can already see signs from people saying, we don't want any apartments here. Like, I don't know if you've driven down there, and that's what those people are saying. We don't want to change in the zoning so that that would allow for apartments. And so if that's what you want to do, or your seller or your buyer wants to do, you want to at least know like how that process works.
But that will, the buyer will still need to do the extension.
Right.
That be like the fee that you're talking about, extra for extend this letter of intent, will be like a rule?
Well, it's not a rule, it's something they would negotiate. So if you're,
Okay,
if your client or your buyer, I've got to have the zoning, and then you're basically negotiating who's going to take the burden of changing that zoning. And so in this residential builder example, most of the folks that because we for a while were getting these contracts repeatedly where, one of these home builders would put this huge piece of property up under contract, excuse me, and it would be like years later or over a year, but they would take like kind of like the burden of working with the county for that, because the owners they're just not sophisticated enough, and they didn't have the money to draw up like the plat and what it's gonna cost and do all those things.
okay.
But so that's something you have to decide, hey, we're gonna buy this, but we really need to change it to industrial. So either you or more a better off, your buyer should understand what that process is gonna be like and be okay with, hey, it's gonna take this long to do this. And so I wanna make sure my due diligence period is at least that long. And if we don't get it in that period of time, then do you wanna pull out, or do you wanna be able to like write a check to extend the period of time to do that?
And another question I have, how about if the owner wants also to sell the business itself? Because I had a situation like that too, not here in Virginia. And the owner was, okay, I wanna sell the shop and everything else, but I don't need a license. I wanna send the license, all the equipment and everything else. We did a separate sale agreement for all of this, but I was still, is that normal, just in case if you have a situation like that? You still do two contracts for a situation
Yeah.
like that, or?
Yeah, so I mean, that happens, right? I mean, you've got like a restaurant owner, or
Exactly.
maybe like a dentist. Not only do I own the building and the land, but I'm ready to retire and I don't want to
The
practice
license,
anymore.
exactly.
So that's a good question. So if you didn't pick up on what she's saying, a fairly typical commercial deal can be like the small business where I want to sell both the business and I want to sell the building
Mhm.
because I've owned it for 20 years.
Yeah.
So those are two separate transactions, really. I mean, but you want to like keep them so that they make sense, that they're closing on the same date and things like that, but understanding that you're going to have one transaction, one basically process for the building and looking at the building and making sure the building's in good shape and the things that we're talking about and the zoning and all that stuff. And then the business sale, can be just as intensive, if not more, if they want to like look at like, okay, if I'm buying this business, I want to look at your tax returns and stuff like that. Document to me how much money you have been making, which is, the best way to see that is like, what are you reporting to the IRS? It's one thing to say, I'm making $200,000 a year, but I'm only reporting $50,000. So $150,000 of that is cash, right? And so that's part of it too.
But that will be part of this intended.
You would basically
of
have,
the letter, or you do two?
you would have to
different-
do two. You would have to do two, but you would reference in each of the letters of intent and each of the contracts, because if I don't get the business, I don't want to have
Exactly.
this property. So they would relate to each other and have a separate contingency in each that says, if I cancel the business part of it because it's not making the money, I think I'm gonna be able to cancel the purchase of buying the building as well, and vice versa.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah,
It's
it
a-
does.
It's a good question, because that happens quite a bit, right?
Yeah, with commercial.
Any other good questions? Good questions, all right, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna move, if I don't screw this up a little bit. Fingers crossed. All right, okay. Okay, so this is a great form. If you're dealing with, can I take your example? I have a dentist that wants to sell his or her practice and the building. So you could do this for the building, the office building, and then you would do a separate agreement for the business sale. So this works great if you don't have like this residential builder example that I'm talking about. It's just pretty much, it's a building, it's a purchase price, it's a due diligence period, it's financing, and you don't have like a bunch of other contingencies like we need to change the zoning. Or we've got a big environmental problem here, but I still want to move forward. It's probably gonna be better to like have a separate purchase and sale agreement to talk about like, where are we in the process of the reclamation, excuse me, who's gonna be responsible for that and those types of things. But otherwise, this is a great form that would work for you. And so going back to like the differences between like this purchase and sale agreement and the residential purchase and sale agreement, these can be a lot easier to deal with because of the financing. So because of the residential regulations, the state and the federal regulations, the truth in lending, RESPA, all of that stuff, and the disclosures that the lenders are required to make, you guys are constantly, like in the residential, it has the appraisal that it has the truth in lending, so that you can move forward with the loan. You're just not dealing with that type of complexity with the financing in this. And so this can be a little bit easier to deal with, because of like, frankly, you probably have like a little bit more sophisticated folks that you're dealing with when you're in a commercial transaction. There's gonna be less emotional hand holding. So it can be easier, but not quite as exciting. And so if you like drama, maybe you find this boring. I don't know, but you're just not gonna have people getting offended because the home inspector found something wrong with their house and they're willing to cancel the contract because it seems unfair. You're not gonna have that type of thing. You have a seller that wants to make money and close, and you have a buyer that once that they figure out that it's gonna be a good investment for them, they're gonna wanna move forward. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're gonna see a lot of similarities. It's basically structured the same way as that residential contract. So you have the parties and the property, identifying the seller and the buyer. So the seller specifically, I raised like the fraud thing at the beginning. This is like important to figure out like, who is the seller and who's authorized to sign the contract on behalf of the seller. So use Sunbiz to make sure that, hey, who's going to be signing on behalf of the seller, or you see that they've signed and it's not somebody that you see on Sunbiz, you probably want to see some kind of documentation that they're authorized on behalf of the seller to bind them. Meaning like you don't want to have someone sign for the seller and then like later on they say, well, you weren't an authorized agent, you were just some lowly vice president and you're not authorized to bind the corporation or the LLC. We don't have a contract. So you want to figure that out. If it's not the person on Sunbiz, you want to understand why that is. And there could be like a separate resolution or something like that that identifies this person. The street address, the description of the property, the legal description here could be a little bit more important than what you're used to seeing, because if you have like this big tract of land, like the acreage I keep talking about, you probably want to get a separate legal description to attach as Exhibit A there. The purchase price, again, very similar to filling out like, what's the deposit, what's the purchase price, is there going to be any financing amount? Very similar to what you would see in this residential forms, the NEFAR form and the FARGAR form. I just wanted to say this totally like triggered my thing, but I did want to bring this up like an update. Going back to the residential, it would even be applicable here. The foreign buyer You guys remember last year they came out with a foreign buyer? And so, you know, the state legislature in Florida said if certain people that are affiliated with a country of concern or something like that are not allowed to buy property in the state of Florida, that would be applicable here. However, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, you may or may not know that the federal government sued the state of Florida saying that that statute's unconstitutional because it unfairly discriminates. So they're actually litigating in trial over this, but the appellate court has said that until they finish litigating that statute is not enforceable. So they have to wait for the years it's going to take for them to do all that stuff in the trial court to figure out if that statute's gonna be enforceable or not. So I would say, like, I would wait for Fred, hopefully they'll come out soon and decide how they want to deal with that. I don't want to speak for them, I'm not sure, but for the time being, that statute's not enforceable. Time for acceptance, the effective date. So again, you're putting a limitation to respond to the offer that you would make. So if you are gonna use this, again, the buyer's agent's gonna fill this out and present it to the listing agent. So the effective date of this contract is a date on which the last one of the seller, the buyer, has signed and initialed and delivered this to the other side. So you've got the signing and delivery requirement that you see under the NEFAR and the FAR bar. So this is using the calendar days, and then here the end of the day is 5, not 7 like NEFAR. And then you would select your closing date. If you want to have something else set up where you want to set the closing, which may be common, to set it within a certain amount of time after like when the inspection contingency is over or the financing contingency is over, you can do something like that. If you want to set up like a separate addendum to the contract. The initialing is required, which I like. I know they don't do that with NEFAR, but I think it's a good idea for everybody to initial each page. Noting where the location of the closing is going to take place. So typically you would have it in the same county where the property, is located. So here's the financing contingency. So most of the time, the financing contingency and the inspection of the due diligence contingency are set for the same period of time. So basically, during like 30 days, they're trying to figure out whether they want to move forward with the property, and at the same time trying to figure out if they can get a loan. And so that's customary. You would see maybe a little bit longer due diligence period, which lasts just as long as the financing contingency. But here, they can put in the information about the interest rate and those types of things. So again, I would kind of like recommend to you again, if you're going to do this, get involved in the commercial real estate community. Find your favorite loan officer that you can keep up to date on what the recent rates are for different buildings, or maybe they're not doing a lot of financing in one particular sector. I know the office is tough because everyone's wondering whether everybody's going to get back to work or something like that. Let's see, the title, so very similar to the residential contract. They're representing that they actually have title to the property, and that will order the title search during that period. Okay, I do want to talk about on the next page. Sorry guys, I'm not keeping you. Yep, so here. So here's this, again, this is an as-is contract here. So you typically would see a little bit longer, a due diligence period. They don't have a default here, but I wouldn't be surprised to see like 30 days for them to do everything that they need to do. So they have a long laundry list of all potential things that they can do, but at the end of the day, they can pretty much do whatever they want, or deem appropriate during the due diligence period, except like putting holes in the property damaging the property that can't be easily repaired, those types of things. So again, it is an as-is type of situation where especially the seller saying, I'm not making any representations about the property, I'm not agreeing to doing any repairs. So buyer, you need to do whatever inspections you deem appropriate, but they can then elect to terminate the contract and get the binder deposit for any reason. And that reason typically is gonna be, I don't think it's gonna make money for me. Let's see. So very similar, closing procedure. Are they gonna take possession? Is it occupied? Are the tenants gonna stay? So if, yeah, so the operation during the contract, so they're gonna keep operating it. They're gonna take care of it the way that they have been through the closing. So if there's a tenant there, again, just a reminder, just because you have a closing and a new owner of the property, if there's any existing leases, those leases are still enforceable. And probably the buyer wants, if it's a good tenant, it's a good lease, they're gonna wanna keep those folks there. And so here, they're not gonna do anything that will materially affect the property without the buyer's consent. And then here, the costs they're talking about, buyer's gonna pay its attorney's fees, the seller's gonna pay the transfer taxes, the title insurance. The buyer will typically pay for the survey in the commercial transaction because sometimes the survey is gonna be a little bit more complicated. They might have more information on it than you would see in a residential transaction. So it's like, buyer, you pay for whatever survey that you deem appropriate. So for example, you can actually pay the surveyor to locate each and every tree on the property if that's what they want to do, and that can become quite expensive if there's a lot of trees, obviously. But especially like with the closing costs, it doesn't really matter who pays the closing costs as long as they get paid. So it's even more negotiated that you might see in a commercial transaction. I'm just trying to go through, everything else is pretty much the same. So you would see like a proration of the taxes, any special assessments or liens that are there before the closing, the seller has got to take care of that. The escrow agent is going to hold the binder deposit. If there's a default, the buyer is going to lose their binder deposit, or the seller can be sued for specific performance if they refuse to close. Let's see. So I do want to highlight this. So this contract may be assigned to a related entity and otherwise it's not assigned, and otherwise is not assignable. So basically this is somewhat common in the commercial context that I mentioned before, that the buyer may have a specific LLC that all it does is put things under contract and they assign it right before closing. That's fairly common, and that's what this related entity is talking about. And here's identification of the brokers. And then here's your additional terms that you're given to. So if you want to set that closing date or put anything else there, you can. And then here, the signatures. So here's, I had mentioned this before, it's important to identify who's an authorized signer of the buyer. If it's intended to be able to bind the buyer and the seller there. The tax ID number, I'm not crazy about that. You want to kind of keep that stuff outside of something like that. So it's not required, but you can't have a separate tax ID number, obviously, for a company or an LLC. it's not critical to have that for the purchase and sale agreement, and that can always come up later.
Will be added on the title.
The tax ID number?
Yeah,
No, it's not gonna come up on a title, but if you go to Sunbiz, for example.
I mean on the deed, yeah, deed should, doesn't the deed needs to show who the owner is, and if it's an LLC,
Yeah, but you're not gonna, the deed doesn't need the tax ID, the federal
Oh,
tax ID number. But you can pull that if you really, really need it from
Okay,
Sunbiz.
okay.
Sunbiz is gonna have like the tax ID numbers, there for all the different entities in the state of Florida. It's not required for the contract or the deed. So that's pretty much it, unless you guys have any questions about, the commercial contract. I know I kind of blew through that. Is there anything I didn't talk about that you'd like me to talk about? Or-
So we just did with you guys, the sale of a restaurant. We only sold the business, not the building. But Rachel did a contract for us, so we can't use this if there's no real estate involved, correct?
Yeah, it's not really a good fit just because it's all talking about like the property versus the business. And so like, the buyer of the business wants a little bit different information, tax returns and sales tax receipts and things like that. So I would,
No,
so
I
yeah,
didn't want to
Yeah,
get
so
involved,
Rachel-
yeah.
yeah, I would do something separate.
wrote up a contract for us, yes. Rachel was great, our seller was
Yeah.
crazy, but.
Yeah.
What's, yeah.
But yeah, thanks for bringing it up because that is, that I think is an important point. I mean, a lot of the commercial deals involve maybe also the sale of a business. And so you gotta understand that they're related, but they are unfortunately separate transactions that are involved.
But see, this contract says already the following personal properties. The personal property should be whatever is in the building.
Well, you'd wanna negotiate that. You'd wanna, so let's take, for example, like a restaurant, right? And so if it's like they're selling the restaurant and maybe they're not selling the business, but maybe they are taking whatever's there and they're gonna pull it out because they're gonna open a new restaurant. So you wanna make sure, like, in a residential
If there is-
transaction, are we on the same page about what I, as the buyer, am expecting to be there as far as like furniture and inventory? That's like a restaurant for sure with there's some expensive like, stoves and refrigerated storage and all that stuff. When you're meeting with your seller, if you're gonna list that,
Okay.
are you going to want to pull out all this stuff because they may have like purchased this years ago and it's expensive and they plan on using it in a new restaurant. So, just like the residential, make sure everybody's on the same page about like what's staying and what's
Whatever
going.
is there.
Yeah. Because that really, like for a
Yeah.
restaurant or like the dental example, I mean, that's expensive equipment that they have. Are they planning to leave it in place? Good question.
I had a situation my godfather bought with 1031 exchange. I didn't get involved on it, I just helped him a little bit because it was too much. It was in Orlando, and it was a VA medical
Okay.
facility. And they already had contracts for providing, because VA has certain regulations for even the paper towels or, bathroom paper, everything, they have regulation. And they have a contract with this vendor that is qualified for VA to providing all the things, including cleaning, everything. Well, he didn't like it because the contract was very expensive, but was very interesting to see that. I mean, there are so many differences in commercial that you just, yeah.
I think, just raise my point again, I mean, I think that's where you see like most people kind of pick a niche and they stay in their lane there.
Yeah.
Because that's like, that example is incredibly detailed, right? And so
Yeah.
somebody needs to have like a wealth of knowledge there to understand that, hey, you're gonna have all these requirements about paper towels and
Exactly.
sanitation, if this is what you're gonna do.
It was crazy.
Yeah, and so you don't wanna cut your teeth or that be your first rodeo on something like that, because something could be easily missed for sure.
Yeah, that was an experience. I mean, when you see whatever the government, I mean, the VA requires
I
for,
can imagine, yeah.
yeah, and the contract was already signed for 10 years, but the building was for sale.
Yeah.
You cannot get rid of
Yeah,
that.
and so that's, are any of those contracts like that in place, that is the buyer gonna be obligated to continue those contracts, right? And are there any service agreements that are still in place? Oh, you're fine. So it's important to understand all those different things that are involved. That's why,
Sorry.
oh, you're fine. That's why, I mean, it's, again, it's like, it's good to start off in one place and get up to speed there so that you understand, like, are there gonna be any contracts that survive? What's gonna happen with all these leases if there are any, you know, stuff like that. There's so many different, like, details or idiosyncrasies related to like one type of property that it's hard to learn everything all at the same time.
And I had another case in Virginia. They were selling the property and the building. It was a business, but he didn't sell the business. However, the property was not commercial anymore because they changed the zoning on the entire area. But he came up and he had, grandfather law, and he kept the commercial. This is the only way that he could sell it, but it took a long time to go everywhere, and commercial, it takes a long time to close. I mean,
We can.
I don't do that anymore. I don't do too much.
I'm focusing on residential.
But it's very interesting. I enjoy it because they're challenging.
Yeah, it's a different challenge for sure. Some people like it, some people don't. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I answered all your questions. I know I went through that really fast, but if you do decide to do it, we're here to help you. Happy to help you do that if that's what you want to do.
Thank you for
Thank you.
food too.
Thank you very much.
All right.